All right, I'm setting this up to go live on YouTube. All right, I'm setting this up to go live on YouTube. Setting this up to go live on YouTube. Okay, and I've posted to YouTube a link for anyone who'd like to join from YouTube and instead come over to a format where you can ask questions. You can join our webinar. There's a Q&A function and chat and all that. All right, so thanks everybody for joining us. And this is my first time leading a webinar, so thanks for your patience with all my technical stuff. I've closed the YouTube video, so there's not that feedback of sound. Welcome everybody, and if you have questions at any point, I invite you to post them using the Q&A function because that pops up and I'm able to respond. I might hold questions to the end, or I might hold off on answering them if I feel like I'm going to get to it better later. Otherwise, I'll keep an eye on that and hopefully answer questions as we go. All right. Okay, so our topic for this session, as well as 3 week, not next week, but I'll give you some questions to ponder since there will be a 2-week gap between now and when we continue the series. So this is the first of 4 sessions on the Bible as literature. So today what I'm mostly going to do is give us a general introduction to what reading the Bible as literature is with some examples. And then for the 3 next sessions, so not this Sunday, but next Sunday, but the 3 Sundays after that, we'll be focusing a little more closely on particular literary devices. So this is just an intro, but we will look at some specific verses. All right, the Bible as literature. There we go. Okay, my slides are advancing. All right, so I'm going to start by introducing 4 ways of reading the Bible. Now, I personally use all 4 of these ways. They're not mutually exclusive. They overlap with each other, and you can practice any of them in different ways. But just for our purposes, I'm going to take some time to distinguish them, and I'll also give you a little bit of insight into my own biography and how these have played out in my own life. So if you've been worshiping in the Episcopal Church for any length of time, you're certainly familiar with liturgical reading of the Bible. So liturgical reading is usually public reading of the Bible as an act of worship. Now, here in the Episcopal Church, we read according to a schedule. We can't just pick the verses that we like or the passages that inspire us at that moment. We follow usually a 3-year schedule for Sundays and then a 2-year schedule for daily Bible reading. But we hear large passages of scripture, long stories, depending on which version of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament readings we're following. We might spend the whole summer on prophets or on kings, pretty much in the order that they're written or that they appear in biblical narratives. So most of us are most familiar in the Episcopal Church with liturgical reading of the Bible. And some of you know my upbringing is in the Episcopal Church. So this is what I was most familiar with, first of all. But there's also devotional reading of scripture. And I think a lot of us are habituated to this type of reading as well. So this is usually more private reading, in the context of Bible studies or personal quiet time, if that's something in your background, I was encouraged to do. But it's usually more private reading of the Bible to increase our affection for God or to shape our personal character. So I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but I also went to a couple of evangelical summer camp sessions, and I participated in a Presbyterian youth group that had Bible studies, especially girls' Bible studies. And I went to a Church of Christ affiliated college. I was part of a freshman girls' Bible study, which you'll hear more about. So devotional reading is very common, reading the Bible in this way. And I'll say here at St. Paul's, I think a lovely thing that we do is if you're on our email list for the reflection questions for next Sunday's reading, what you get is the text of the readings that are scheduled for next Sunday, but also some questions to prompt more devotional reading. So here at St. Paul's, we try to make sure that these ways of reading feed into each other. You might have a reflection throughout the week on these texts, and then you come to church on Sunday and hear them read aloud publicly as part of worship, or you tune in on Sunday and hear those readings. So we do a lot of devotional reading at St. Paul's as well. Next, there's historical critical reading. So everyone goes to college, if they go to college, to experiment with new things, okay? So the new thing that I experimented with in college, I know these are big disclosures here, is historical critical reading of the Bible. So historical critical reading is the dominant academic approach to biblical texts. It usually involves discovering the earliest form of a biblical text and maybe its original context. Okay. So I know there's at least one group that meets at St. Paul's that really focuses on historical critical reading of the Bible. And I know from conversation with folks that this is an area that many people are excited to explore. Kind of a subset here is what we call source criticism. So that's recognizing that the Bible is composed from different units and different traditions. And we try to piece together where they got all of those traditions, whether it's a priestly community that preserved one version of a story and maybe another version is kind of like an oral folk tale and they put them together. Some of you are very familiar with that method of reading the Bible. All right. But we're doing none of these things today, you guys. We are exploring, oh, shoot. I think let me redo this screen sharing. Sorry, you guys. Okay, we're back. Okay, literary reading. So this is learning to recognize and experience the effects of specific techniques in biblical narrative and poetry. So that's what we'll be doing. And I'll say that this practice really enhances my appreciation for liturgical reading and for devotional reading as well. And it's kind of a little bit of a reaction to historical critical reading, which sometimes focuses way too much on where different, kind of pulling the biblical text apart to see where all of its sources come from, and less on appreciating the literary qualities of the whole. All right, so again, these are not mutually exclusive. You can practice all of them and they can support each other. But I think literary reading is the most neglected in Christian communities today, especially in the United States. And so that's why it's going to be our focus here. So I'm going to illustrate the difference between literary approaches to the Bible and devotional approaches, because I think devotional approaches are kind of the ones many Christians are most familiar with. I'm going to use that. I'm going to illustrate the difference by focusing on Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 30. So or 10 to 31. Oh, hold on. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So if you're not familiar with this text, it just is a great instance of what devotional reading would be, because there are so many devotionals, devotional guides to this particular text. So devotional reading, just remember, it's reading a biblical text in order to develop or cultivate deeper affection for God or to shape personal character. So I encountered this particular passage, Proverbs, which is a description of a perfect wife. And it's at the very end of the book of Proverbs. I encountered it as part of Bible studies for girls or young women. On the left here, you see a classic in this genre of devotional guides for women called Becoming a Woman of Excellence. And on the right-hand side, on my right-hand side, we have a 30th anniversary edition. So there are lots of women like me who kind of, grew up on this way of reading the text and who maybe encountered Proverbs 31 as in this form. And I'll say in this aspect of Christian culture, there was a lot of emphasis, including in my freshman girls Bible study at Pepperdine, where I went to college, a lot of emphasis on praying for your future husband and praying for your future children and focusing on being cultivating the kind of character traits in that time of your life. So this is when I was 17, 18, that would eventually make you the best wife and mother that you could be. So this is sort of like a guide to that. So sometimes this passage is called the wife of noble character. All right, so I'm not going to read through all of it. I'm just going to give you a taste for it. And this is the New International Version translation, which is the Bible I was using at that time. So, a wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. Okay, and then, all right. She gets up while it is still night. She provides food for her family. Okay, this is like, you got to get up early, get the oatmeal going. She has female servants. That did not come true for me, any servants. But in her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hand to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household. I'm doing well on this one because I used through the Land's End Labor Day sale, I bought all of my kids' winter gear. So I'm good on that one. But you get the idea, right? You read these things and they inspire you to be the kind of person described in this text. I like this last one. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Now, this last part makes clear that while a lot of women use this text to describe the kind of person they aspire to be, it actually was written for a male audience, encouraging them to marry the right kind of woman. Don't just go for someone charming and pretty, right? Go for someone who fears the Lord. There'll be big payoffs to that. All right. So this is the general text. So for some of you, you may have never encountered. Others may be going, oh, yes, I know what a Proverbs 31 woman is. Okay. So if that's you, you'll know there are all these kinds of devotional journals, devotional guides to this particular passage. I like these kind of images where they just extract verses and make them into posters or memes. One looks like a jewelry ad, one looks like a makeup ad, but it includes these warnings, right? That better than jewels is a good wife, better than beauty is a woman who fears the Lord. There's also merchandise, right? You can be a Proverbs 31 woman, but you get the idea, that you read this text to be a better person, the kind of person you believe God is calling you to be. So we have a list of virtues here. This kind of woman seeks wisdom, is honest, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So I'm going to pause here and totally shift gears. We're going to look at the same passage, but we're going to use a different approach, which is a literary reading. So literary reading involves learning to recognize and experience the effects of specific techniques in biblical narrative and poetry. So what I have pictured on the left is quite unlike all of those devotional guides I showed you, quite unlike that Becoming a Woman of Excellence book that I used, that was important to me when I was a younger woman, is a translation and commentary by a man named Robert Alter. So the translations I'm going to share with you are his, and his specialty is these literary readings, literary translations that emphasize and make visible to us the literary techniques that other translations usually hide. So I have here I just took a photo of what this book looks like on the inside. And what you'll see is at the top of that sort of line is the actual text. And at the bottom are the notes. All right, so there's a lot of commentary. So this is Robert Alter explaining different things about his translation choices and about the literary techniques that might have escaped first glance. Okay. Also, so this is a little trickier to see. So look at the text itself. It's framed like a poem. And let's see, let's take the first one. So on the left-hand side where it says a worthy woman who can find. On the right-hand side are the numbers of the verses. Okay, so I love how he does this. He just puts the verse numbers on the outside just as a guide, but he doesn't let them clog up the text, right? Because the purpose isn't to extract verses and put them on posters, right? The purpose is to appreciate this as a whole literary unit. So the verse numbers are useful just as references, but he is discouraging us from just quoting and pulling specific verses. Sometimes it's hard to know which number goes with which words. On the left-hand column, though, you might recognize characters from the Hebrew alphabet. So he's included those for a very particular reason, and that's to show a literary feature of this particular poem about the noble wife. I'll say what that is. Okay. So it turns out, and I, as someone who grew up, reading this text, I never knew until Alter's translation and commentaries that this whole poem about a worthy wife is an acrostic poem. So an acrostic poem is a poem in which the first letters of every line combine to spell a word. So this is a popular elementary school exercise. If you've ever done this, like I would write my name, Laura Walsh, Lora, and then I'd have to write a poem that corresponds to, or where each line starts with the first one with the letter L, first one, next one with the letter O, then R, then A. So this is a famous one by Lewis Carroll. I've bolded the first letters so you can see that it spells out the first letter of each line, Alice Pleasant's Little, which is the name of Alice's name. Okay, so it's a poem about her passing childhood. All right. So we move on. Okay, so that's something that you can't really capture that in translation, although I dare someone, right? Try it out for me. That would be great. Try to translate it in that way. All right, so you usually can't notice that or capture that in English translation, but that's what the notes tell us. So it's a poem. The notes are also great for showing us connotations of words. So connotations are the additional meanings or moods that are commonly attached to a word beyond its obvious literal meaning. So I'll give you an example of that. All right. So this is Robert Alter's translation of the first couple verses of that passage. A worthy woman who can find, her price is far beyond rubies. The heart of her husband trusts her, and no prize does he lack. So what we have here are, let's see. Yeah, so I bold-faced a couple words that where Robert Alter wants to tell us that this word in the Hebrew original has connotations, that is, additional meanings that we might not pick up on as speakers of English. So whatever this Hebrew word is for worthy, he says it's usually used in martial context, that is, texts about war, and it connotes vigor and strength. So this helps us appreciate something else about this poem, that it's not a text for women to learn how to be the very best women that they can be. It's really a text for men to encourage them to enjoy the domestic sphere and to see it as exciting and thrilling as they might see, depending on the culture they were raised in, the arena of war and battle. So I'm always reminded here of, I forget, it's an Updike short story. And I remember the husband, it's told in first person, he goes to buy some takeout or pizza or something. And he says, I wielded my wallet, so it's like a way of, so he doesn't just say, I took my wallet out, right? That translation, if we were translating somehow Updike story, which is written in English, into another language, we'd want the readers to know that the word used for wielded, for I took out my wallet, I wielded my wallet, is something from, knights wield weapons, and so the author is trying to make the mundane domestic life seem as exciting as war, okay? And also this word for prize has additional connotations. It's used also in martial context of war, as booty, right? So no prize does he lack. So, if you grow up in a warrior culture, you're used to raiding villages and whatever to try to get the spoils of war. It's how a lot of communities, survived and made their living, right? Robbing other ones. And so he's saying, if you could go out on these military escapades and adventures and get booty, or you could stay home. And this is where it gets really awkward, you guys, but this is why he can't use booty, and get the best booty possible, right? So English words have connotations too that you don't want to import into the biblical text, but that's why we have notes. So Robert Alter can tell us those things. So again, as someone who read this passage in a devotional context, I always thought that it was, advice for me on how to be a good wife, right, and mother, and a home economist, But really, now I see it's really infused. It tries to make domestic life exciting, right? As exciting as battle, and it's supposed to make it appeal to men. All right, so it's not just about me being the best wife I could be. It's about men investing in their domestic life. All right, so now we're going to switch to techniques that are, techniques that are more that are easier to capture in translation, which Robert Alter captures in his translation, but which often are missed in other English language translations of biblical texts. So this first one is called intensification parallelism. I know a lot of these have real technical names, but there you go. Okay, so this is a technique that's common in Hebrew biblical poetry. I sometimes describe it as how Hebrew biblical poetry rhymes, okay? So it doesn't rhyme in the sense of sound, it rhymes in a different way. But basically, so a term or a phrase from one half of a verse of biblical poetry repeats in the second half of the verse. But that term repeats usually not using the exact word, but using an unusual version of that word, or something more specific, or something more concrete that's a loose synonym for the other. So let me use this example, how Robert Alter captures this in his translation. So the first verse, half of a verse, says, this is about the same, this worthy woman, her hands, she reaches out to the distaff, and her palms hold on to the spindle. Okay, so what you can see is in the first half of the verse, we have hand, and in the second half of the verse, he translates this as palm. So something more concrete. And it would be a little strange in English anyway to say, she reaches out her palms to the needy, So we can see it's just a little bit more unusual in the second half of the verse. So this is very common in the Psalms, for example. There are different varieties of intensification parallelism, but this is one. They're great examples. Once you know about this technique, you'll never read the Psalms in the same way. But some translations do a good job of capturing this, and others are not don't make it a priority. Okay, but that's intensification parallelism. Now I wanted to compare intensification parallelism in other translations. So I looked at the NIV. Again, that's the version I used when I first encountered this text, and let's see what it does. So in her hand, she holds the distaff, it says, and grasps the spindle with her fingers. Okay, so I will say that this version seems to capture that technique pretty well. So you've got hand, and then you've got fingers. Okay, so a larger object and then something more concrete. And there's even intensification parallelism between the words reaches and hold in Alter's translation, and holds and grasps in the NIV. So they did a good job there. All right, but I'm going to introduce another technique, and that is called chiasmus. So chiasmus is a technique that's very common in ancient poetry and in ancient biblical narrative, in which, this is a little complicated, two or more words or narrative patterns appear in one order and then repeat in the reverse order. So when people are writing about chiastic structure or chiasmus, they identify the different elements as A and then B, and then B apostrophe A apostrophe. So we can see how it works. Now, I use a simple example. Over the course of a larger biblical unit, you could have A, B, C, D, D apostrophe, C apostrophe, B apostrophe, A apostrophe. The book of Esther is structured in that way, where there are all these parallel moments. Okay. So, but Alter captures this very well. So her hands, she reaches out to the distaff, and her palms hold on to the spindle. Then we get the next verse. So this is intensification parallelism, but it's chiastic with the verse that follows. Her palm she opens to the poor, and her hands she extends to the wretched. All right, isn't that beautiful? Her hands she reaches out to the distaff, and her palms hold on to the spindle. Her palm she opens to the poor, and her hands she extends to the wretched. Okay, so let's compare this. I know the suspense is going to be killing us, you guys. Does the NIV, which did such a good job with hands and fingers, does it capture chiastic structure? Does it capture chiasmus, as well as altars? Okay, so we already saw this. In her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. Oh no, it blew it. Okay, she opens her arms to the poor. Now you can see why they chose that, right? Because that's idiomatic in English. We say that. She opens her hands to the poor. Opens her arm. You know, her arms are open wide. Okay, that's a common expression in English. So NIV chose to go with common English idiom rather than translate the word for fingers and arms the same way. So in her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. Okay. So while the first verse does capture intensification parallelism, the two-verse unit does not reflect the chiasmus that is present in the original. So in her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. So it obscures the chiastic structure because it uses loose synonyms, fingers and arms, rather than the same term. Okay, now this is very common in biblical translations, where repeating the same word over and over again is not really to modern tastes. All right, this happens in my own writing and in student writing. If I read it, you know, I forget. I had a professor in college who talking about his own writing, he said, I always use the word expatiate. And my editors say you can only use expatiate once in an article or once in an entire book. That's all you get, you know. So some of us have I have that habit with the word convey. I just keep using it over and over again. But modern editors usually don't prefer that, okay? But biblical authors do repeat the same words over and over again, but for good reasons that we'll talk about a little more. One is just for this chiastic structure. Now, if you're saying to yourself, which I have to say to myself too, I'm not a great Hebraicist. Okay, I don't know Hebrew very well. There's a great tool, and you can find these online or buy them, called an Interlinear Bible. So if you ever want to check, you know, because you might have wondered, like, well, what does the Hebrew say, right? Does it say hands, palms, palm, hands, or hand? I forget which are plural and which are singular. Or does it use a different word for fingers and arms? Well, what you can do is look at a Hebrew interlinear Bible. And if you don't read Hebrew characters, you can see what's written in blue is a transliteration. And so there's a direct translation in orange, right? Which is just to tell you what the words mean. what you'll see here is actually that the two words that are used for hand, and so the Hebrew uses two different words for hand, but they can both mean hand. Like if you encountered them in other texts, you'd be fine translating all of these words as hand every time it occurs. But they are different words. So just, for the sake of us not working directly with the Hebrew, we'll say it uses word A for hand and then word B for hand, both synonyms. And then again, it uses word B for hand, that same word, which you can tell if you read the transliterations in blue, that's the same one. B for hand and then term A for hand. And so that's what Robert Alter wants to reflect in his translation, which other English translations do not. So if you ever want to check, try using an interlinear Bible. Gets us as close to the Hebrew as we can without actually knowing Hebrew. All right. So let's see how other versions do with this. So here it is, just laid out beautifully. And I don't go into this, but another thing that Robert Alter does so great is to keep the verb and noun order the same as they are in Hebrew. The English translations didn't do that. So that's just part of how it reads so poetically. Her hands, she reaches out to the distaff, and her palms hold onto the spindle. Her palm she opens to the poor, and her hands she extends to the wretched. Okay. So I understand, because of this chiasmus, this 2-verse unit belongs together, right? It's crafted to hang together. So I'm going to use a little analogy here to this famous painting, American Gothic, right? It's a unit, right? It has two halves that belong together. This husband and wife, right? But so here's my analogy. This is one of those, I'll take her away real quick. Memes where people have extracted verses from this passage and, put them on posters and images and stuff. So what this is it's the second half, the second verse of what I just showed you, put together with some other biblical verse, right? She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hand to the needy. She's not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. All right. So to me, if you're sensitive to the literary features of Hebrew biblical poetry, that is like cutting American Gothic in half and making that your poster on the wall, right? We've completely missed, and this one actually uses hand and hands. It doesn't use different words the way the Hebrew did. So, it's a disaster there as well, I guess. But hopefully, if this analogy works for you, you get the idea that sometimes devotional readings not only obscure, but kind of like deface the literary integrity of the biblical passage itself. So it's broken the chiastic structure by just taking the, one verse out of context. So we can't see the chiasmus anymore. All right, so we've seen what the NIV does. Let's take a look at some other translations. Do they reflect intensification parallelism and or chiastic structure? So let's do the Living Bible. She sows for the poor and generously helps those in need. Okay, so already we're saying, no, it doesn't even use hands and palms. Okay, so sows for the poor and generally helps those in need. I don't know. I wouldn't really describe that as intensification parallelism. It doesn't get more concrete. Okay, so it's just she's good at sewing. Oops. And let's see. Oh yeah, that's right. It's here I am, you guys, clicking away to try and find the second part of the verse. But the Living Bible is mostly a paraphrase, right? So it doesn't have, I don't know, like these 4 verses, these 4 half verses all get compressed into here. So her hands, she reaches out to the distaff, and her palms hold on to the spindle becomes just, she sows for the poor, right? And her palm she opens to the poor, and her hands she extends to the wretched just becomes, she generously helps those in need. So in this more devotional translation, we don't get any of the literary features. We just get the virtues, right? And in a devotional reading, often it's the virtues that are important. That the assumption is the biblical text exists to promote virtues to women in this case, right? Not to create beautiful poetry for everyone, men and women, to enjoy. All right. Then we have the message, okay? So it becomes, she's skilled in the crafts of home and hearth, diligent in homemaking. And the second, so we don't get hands or palms at all, let alone intensification parallelism. She's quick to assist anyone in need. She reaches out to help the poor. Okay, so we do get the image of reaching out, but it's the same idea that, this woman is a great, crafty homemaker, okay? And she's also generous, right, to the poor, to people who are not in her own household. These are great things, but what a difference. In the message we get, promoting handicrafts to women. And in Robert Alster's translation, we get an example of literary art. Okay. Quite a difference. All right. So I have to admit, it's very easy to pick on the message. And I like the message translation for different things. But it's not trying to be an exact translation. It's trying to be a devotional paraphrase of the Bible. But that's what makes it such a great example of devotional readings, what devotional readings turn to Proverbs 31 for versus what literary readings do. So let's check our own translation that we use most commonly, the NRSV. So that's what's most commonly used here at St. Paul's, as well as in the Episcopal Church in general, and also for historical critical readings, so academic readings of the Bible. Let's take a look at that. What does the NRSV have? All right, she puts her hands to the distaff. Okay, so far so good. And her hands hold the spindle. Okay, this is an abomination, you guys, because it's done hands. It said, synonym A for hands will translate as hands. Synonym B for hands will translate that as hands. Okay, so instead of capturing the fact that the biblical text uses different words for hands, and trying to reflect that is just like, they all mean hands. Okay, so the NRSV is what would happen if a bunch of academics got together and tried to translate the Bible, and that's actually what happens. It's a product of a committee of academics. So there we go. All right, and so again, it keeps using hands. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. So we get hands, all right? So no literary sensibilities at all. And so this is what we read in church, and etc. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So Evan has this question. How many different versions would you recommend we read side by side? So my answer to that question, I'll put answer live, is this is the only one, right, that I know of is Robert Alter's. Okay, so if you want literary features, I would recommend ignoring all these others. They can serve other purposes, right? But it's more, it's not about which translation is the best biblical translation. It's which translation is best for the purpose you want it to serve. So if you want to recognize literary qualities of biblical texts, you can only use Robert Alter's version. And it's not just the translation, it's the commentaries as well. NRSV isn't going to do it. I recommend annotated NRSVs all the time for historical critical reading, not for literary reading though. And the Interlinear Bible, of course, is a great check on, what words are exactly being translated in what particular way. So I would avoid the whole, even though I'm demonstrating it here, the whole look at multiple translations. Mostly I'm just showing how bad they are. This is my big sales pitch. I don't get commission, you guys, for Robert Alter's translations, but there you go. Okay, and we'll do a similar thing though. Let's see. Oh yeah, so one more technique, thematic keywords. This is one of my favorites. These are significant words that repeat, often throughout or through a short poem or a narrative episode that stress a theme of the passage. So we'll see that in a future adult forum. but I just want to introduce it here. So here, Robert Alter notes that at the very beginning of this passage, we have this word worthy, a worthy woman who can find her price is far beyond rubies. And then toward the end of the passage, many daughters have done worthy things, but you surpass them all. Now, when I read these side by side, I think, at the beginning, they say, a worthy woman who can find. And then by the end of the passage, it says, well, there are actually lots of worthy women in the world. Okay, many have done worthy things, but you are the best. Okay, I like this because it starts out like no one's worthy. It's so hard to find a worthy woman. But by the end of the poem, it's like, there actually are lots of women who meet these criteria, but you're my favorite, or you're the best of all of them. Or so, it's kind of sweet, right? And because of this repetition of worthy, I don't know, it just accentuates that this poem moves in a direction. It's not just like, here's a list of virtues that you have to have. It sort of starts off as, worthy women are hard to find. And it's like, actually, a lot of women can be worthy. And it repeats that word, so it helps us to make that connection between the beginning and the end of the poem. Okay. So let's see how well other translations do of picking up on this thematic key word. And the theme here is worthy, what makes someone worthy? And just to emphasize again, not just worthy, like worthy of love, but like a real prize, like you would want in a battle. And the notes emphasize, by the way, that in case you forgot, Robert Alter is good at saying, remember you saw this word a few verses back. All right, NIV. A wife of noble character who can find, she's worth far more than rubies. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Okay, so it got it, right? It decided to translate the same word in the same way at verse 10 and verse 29. Okay, back to the Living Bible. If you can find a truly good wife, she is worth more than precious gems. There are many fine women in the world, but you are the best of them all. Okay, so it doesn't make anyway, so it uses good once and fine again, so it doesn't make as strong a connection between the claim that a worthy woman is hard to find and the claim that actually there are lots of worthy women, but you're the best. Okay, so by saying a truly good wife who can find, and then there are many fine women, but you're the best. It's not clear that those fine women are also good, that they meet the criteria. It almost makes it sound like, there are some women who are okay, but you're the only one who's good. You surpass them all. I think Alter's translation makes it a little clearer that many women are worthy. The Message, a good woman, again, is hard to find. And again, good, right? That totally misses all the connotations. Worthy doesn't capture them either, but good, it just seems like this is all about finding a wholesome person, not like the excitement of living domestic life. And then many women have done wonderful things. So again, it's good once and wonderful the next time. Okay, so it doesn't emphasize that the same word is being used in this nice, compact poem. NRSV, this is what we use, a capable wife who can find. Many women have done excellently. Okay, so NRSV, what we saw before, right, is it was translating synonyms for hands, just all as hands, okay? And here, when it finally gets a chance, to translate the same word in the same way twice, it uses synonyms, okay? And it captures the meaning. My problem here isn't that it has misconstrued the passage, but in a way, like it's missed everything about this poem, that the conclusion it comes to, that it starts by thinking a worthy woman is rare and ends by realizing that there are many worthy women, but you can still have your favorite, your favorite one. Okay, so NRSV blows it. I'm sorry. All right, this is my pitch. Only Robert Alter if you want literary qualities. Okay, so just to get the bigger picture, a devotional approach to Proverbs 31 would see it as a source of verses that inspire women to be better wives and mothers in order to fulfill a God-given model of worth. Okay. By contrast, then, and like I said, this is how I encountered the text and understood it for years, and I'll say, valued it. It can't hurt, right? The 16, 17, 18-year-old to plan ahead, right, for what kind of person she wants to be. But a literary approach would translate this text in such a way that it reflects devices such as intensification parallelism, chiasmus, and thematic keywords. Okay, so I can't stress this enough, right? That there are these techniques that can be reflected in translation and that are sometimes in the NIV, right? We saw that, but are best reflected in Robert Alter's translation because he made that intentional choice. This isn't to say that Alter's translation is always the best for everything, right? Biblical translation is very contentious. And you can read reviews of Alter's translation where people say, I can't believe he translated such and such in, ABC in way XYZ. Okay, so it's always a matter of debate. But for literary qualities, his is pretty much the only one that makes that a priority. Although I should say, and sometimes the King James Bible does. It's actually particularly good at retaining the order of nouns and verbs in the original or in the Latin, if it was working from that. Okay, so translate, yeah. Oh, but I should say there is no New Testament that does this. But I'm working on one. It's going to take me a lot of years though. So no one hold your breath. And someone might do it before I do. But I think the New Testament could really do with a literary translation. Alter just does the Hebrew Bible. Okay, but and then the literary approach uses footnotes. So the footnotes are the commentary to identify untranslatable features, such as the martial connotations of particular terms and the acrostic form of the poem, right? So there's some things that we're going to miss in translation, but Alter's translation at least, or his commentary at least tells us that they are there. All right, so here I have just a real excerpted version. And again, I'm not an accomplished reader of public performer of poetry, but I figured I'd give it a try here. And this is a compressed version of the whole poem, just emphasizing the technique. So I've condensed this, sorry, so cut out a lot of verses. But I'm going to try to read it in this, a little bit more poetic way, okay? A worthy woman who can find. Her prize is far beyond rubies. The heart of her husband trusts her, and no prize does he lack. Her hands she reaches out to the distaff, and her palms hold on to the spindle. Her palms she opens to the poor, and her hands she extends to the wretched. Her sons rise and call her happy. Her husband, he praises her. Many daughters have done worthy things, but you surpass them all. All right, so it's a poetic rendering, and I have to say I have a personal preference for this more literary translation than the NIV that I grew up on. All right, so I wanted to give you a sneak preview of future sessions in this series, all about literary features of Genesis. So we're actually just going to focus on the book of Genesis, but we may do this again in the future with Exodus or Esther or later biblical books and poetry. And each of our sessions is going to be focused on a specific literary technique or pair of literary techniques. If you would like access to Robert Alter's translations and commentaries so you can read ahead, I recommend The 5 Books of Moses, which is a translation with a commentary, but it includes, Genesis, Exodus, the first 5 books of the Bible. But it's paperback and accessible. But I will be reproducing the translations that I use. So you don't have to have this, but if you want to deep dive, you can. I should say I recommended this to my husband a few years ago. And one morning he said, I'm really tired. He said, I stayed up late last night reading Genesis, because it's just a fresh take, right, on the Bible. So if you want to turn the Bible into a page turner, then I recommend this translation and commentary, because you notice things that if you're familiar with the Bible, you may never have noticed before. So next time, again, not this coming Sunday, but the Sunday after that, we'll focus on this technique of a deliberately restricted vocabulary and related thematic keywords. So when I say deliberately restricted vocabulary, it means when a biblical author could have used, a thesaurus or a whole range of synonyms, they instead choose to repeat the exact same terms at different moments in the biblical narrative. Again, this is one example that is, like I said, not to modern tastes, right? We like variety, but they like to use the same words as sort of a clue to the reader about how that word is changing in its meaning, or as a clue to make connections, right? And we saw worthy being repeated in a poem, so we can make the connection between the beginning of the poem and the near ending of that poem. But here, the connections are these, key words are planted across larger chunks of the book of Genesis. Okay. And thematic keywords might be used repeatedly in a specific episode. Like you see the same word used 6 times, right? Most translators will mix that up a little bit, but Robert Alter does not. Okay. And we'll see why. The next time will be type scenes and the technique of narrative symmetry. So this is when different narrative episodes, like we'll use the example of getting engaged, right? That different engagements of biblical characters look very, very similar. Okay, so if I'll tell you, like if someone's in a hurry and there's a well, you can bet someone's about to be engaged. Okay, so why do biblical authors use very similar repeating narrative patterns with slight differences? And narrative symmetry means that stories are told with very similar elements. And in this case, we'll be encouraged to read texts in parallel that typically are not paired with each other, but it turns out symmetrical. And then my favorite technique, delayed narrative exposition. Okay, so this is when an important piece of information in a story is kept until much later in the telling of that story. So if you are a listener to podcasts or radio documentaries, they use this all the time. This American Life uses this all the time. And the most recent example is, I think, they were interviewing a teacher about what it was like to teach remotely and to have plans change all the time. And then so he was talking about how difficult it was. And then they reveal that he's a choir teacher, okay, which adds an additional layer of difficulty. So this technique is when information that you could have told at the beginning, you reserve for the end for reasons like keeping people interested or surprising them or causing them to look back at what they've heard already in a different way. Okay, so we'll see several examples of that. But between now and then, I wanted to leave you with some questions to ponder. And these are more theological questions. Okay, it's because I'm glad you have 2 weeks to think about it. Okay, I'm glad I have 2 weeks to think a little bit more about this because I usually describe the Bible's literary features in academic classrooms, right? So I don't go into a lot of the theological reflection on these discoveries. And you might be tempted to say, like, what's the big deal if it's hands or palms, for an English speaker? If we walk away from the text, knowing that an ideal wife is generous to her own home as well as to people beyond it, what does it matter if we translate hands as hands or hands as palms, But let's think about this. So when we put more emphasis in our religious practice or religious habits, when we put more emphasis on the meaning of biblical words than on their style, what do we miss? Right? Is the purpose of religious or biblically grounded life to interpret its meaning and apply its meaning to our life? Or might a biblical life involve appreciating style and beauty and pleasure? So what do we miss when we just focus on the meanings, and especially how those, in the devotional reading, how those meanings apply to our life? There's a phrase you hear a lot in Bible study. How does it apply to your life? But what might we miss? Okay. And then the second question, there's only two questions. What does attention to the Bible's literary features reveal to us about God? So, what does it tell us if God is a poet or God inspires poets? What does it tell us about God if God's purpose is to create poetry that is memorable and appealing to us, versus a God who gives us lectures on how to be a better person? I'm sure God wants us to be the best people that we can be, and to read biblical texts as a way of getting to know God. But what does it tell us about God if we notice poetry, symmetry, all of these things about how God wants to relate to and speak to us and reveal God's self to us? So those are the bigger theological questions that I hope we'll be exploring. But most of all, I just wanted to introduce you to literary readings of the Bible as a way to sustain interest, to make old familiar stories seem fresh and new, and as a way to strengthen and complement the liturgical reading and devotional reading and historical critical reading that's already such a strong part of our congregation's life and faithfulness to the Bible. So I will conclude here. And if there are any questions, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for our next installment on the book of Genesis. So bye, everybody. I'll hang out for a minute if there are questions. Oh, good. I know. No, this is true. Okay. Yeah. That's cool. So we have a comment here, and you can use either the chat or the Q&A function. So someone has mentioned that it's hard to read Proverbs 30. Okay. So if you're not in the market for a wife, if you are not married, if you don't have children, also you could say if you don't have servants to pay, this is really interesting. It can be very difficult to relate to the biblical text if what we're trying to do is just apply it to our life, right? And this is a really common issue in biblical study. If it doesn't have a clear, direct application to something concrete in our life circumstances, then we're tempted to be like, I'm just going to skip that part, right? But this is a way to still, interact with the text. And actually, and I should say, it's also a way if you are not sure about this whole Bible thing, because I usually teach this in the context of a secular literary classroom, to say, this is a way we all can read biblical texts. We all can identify their features. We don't have to have any assumptions about divine authorship of the scriptures. We can just, enjoy these features. So so it gives a way to relate to the text, even if our life circumstances are very different than those in the text itself. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, it looks like we're done, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.